Hey guys, this video is for government for my seniors. Remember, we're going to go back to these video schedules now that the election is over. Even though you wouldn't know it because President Trump is not conceded. But make sure you check this YouTube page for videos on your asynchronous days on Tuesday and Friday. And on Thursday, we're just going to pick up from where we leave off on this video. So please make sure that you watch this from start to finish. Okay, today we're going to talk about the president's team. Now, this is particularly timely because we have a new president, and one of his first acts of business is going to be appointing a cabinet, appointing a set of advisors, appointing a staff, people who are going to help him with the job of being president. Joe Biden has already named Ron Klain to be his chief of staff, but he really has not. And he appointed a COVID advisory team, but he hasn't really made any other appointments yet. It usually takes a few weeks after an election to actually fill out your cabinet, and your cabinet has to be confirmed then by the United States Senate. And because Joe Biden is probably, even though we don't know how the Georgia runoffs are going to turn out, but Biden is probably going to have a Republican Senate. So that means that, if he does, then he's going to have to be mindful of that when he makes a lot of these appointments, because the president's appointments have to be confirmed by the Senate. So this should be very interesting because a lot of progressive groups are urging Biden to actually appoint progressives to important cabinet posts. But those appointments will then have to go before Mitch McConnell and the Republican Senate. So he has to consider that as well. So this should be exciting, to see who President-elect Biden is actually going to pick for his cabinet. Now, the president's team. Now, some positions have been in existence since the beginning of our country's history, since the founding. Others are fairly new. And we're going to talk about that in the course of the video, like which ones are old and which ones are new. Well, maybe do it now. The State Department, Treasury, Defense, which used to be called the War Department, the Justice Department. Those four have been around since George Washington's time. But since then, it's been 230 plus years, there have been a lot of new cabinet departments added. So now there are 15 different cabinet departments. A cabinet department is led by a secretary. So Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, of Interior, etc. The only cabinet position that isn't called secretary is the head of the Justice Department. That's the Attorney General. Now, the president appoints about 2,000 officials to government jobs. Now, there are only 15 cabinet members, so that means there's a lot of other jobs for the president to fill. We have those cabinet members. We have agency directors, like head of the FBI, head of the CIA, head of the Federal Trade Commission. You name it. There are so many different agencies that the president has to appoint a director for. Top military leaders are appointed by the president. Support staff for the president. A lot of people who work in the White House who are his advisors. So there are a lot ambassadors, right, are appointed by the president. So there are a lot of people who the president is responsible for appointing. Now, almost all of these people serve at what they call the pleasure of the president, meaning they can be fired or removed by the president whenever he wants to, without having to give an explanation. Some agency directors, it's different. Like if it's a regulatory agency that's supposed to be independent, then the president usually has to give an explanation for why he wants to fire somebody. But most of these positions that the president fills, can be replaced by the president at any time and for any reason. There is an apparatus in place for the president to actually fill positions without needing Senate approval. It's called a recess appointment. So say the Senate's on vacation or something. The thing is that the president can then fill a position that's vacant, saying, well, and that person is not subject to Senate confirmation because his argument is, well, the Senate's in recess, they're on vacation, and I need this position filled. But usually that person then gets to stay in the position until the end of that Congress. So a Congress meets for 2 years. So whoever the president appoints for a recess appointment, then that person is actually in power until the end of that Congress. Reese's appointments used to be well, they used to be more uh, reasonable because Congress didn't meet that often. So sometimes if a vacancy came up, the president needed to fill the job. But now Congress still takes a lot of vacations, but Congress meets much more often than it did historically. So there's less need. I mean, when historically, I mean like the 1800s or something, or the early 1900s. Congress has actually met less recently than they've met in the previous few decades. But Congress meets more often, so there really is less excuse to actually make a recess appointment because you can just wait a few weeks or whatever, until the Senate comes back. But sometimes presidents make recess appointments when there's somebody who they don't think is going to get confirmed by the Senate, or is going to have some trouble getting confirmed by the Senate. So he just puts in that person in as a recess appointment. President Trump has actually done something that is really unprecedented. A lot of government agencies are led by acting secretaries or acting directors. And when somebody's an acting director or an acting secretary, they don't have to be confirmed by the Senate. Now, again, historically, that was only supposed to be a temporary thing. So, if Congress is, doing something else, or, and you need the position filled right away, you appoint someone in an acting capacity, and then you appoint them regularly, and then they would then have to be confirmed by the Senate. But what Trump has been doing is he's just been filling important positions with acting directors and acting secretaries permanently. He makes you the acting secretary, and then he never submits your name for a permanent appointment. That's just the way it stays. Like, you're just the acting secretary. And Trump actually says he likes that because then he doesn't have to worry about that person having to endure a Senate confirmation, which is usually a very long, involved process. Even though that's not really the point of having an acting appointment. That's just supposed to be very temporary, maybe for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days max. It's not supposed to be somebody who's acting secretary for years, which has sometimes been the case in the Trump administration. Now, the most important member of the president's team, of course, is the vice president of the United States. Now, the vice president is one of only two people, along with the president, who's elected by all the people in the country. The vice president of the United States now is Mike Pence. The vice president of the United States, starting in January 20th, will be Kamala Harris, who is the first woman to ever hold national office, to ever be either president or vice president. Unfortunately, it's taken 230 plus years for that to happen. Now, even though the vice presidency is seen as an extremely important position, and it is a very important position, in reality, it's actually a very poorly defined position. There really is no guidelines for what a vice president should actually do, except for two. They're president of the Senate, meaning they can break ties. If the Senate votes 50-50, the vice president can break the tie. And they basically replace the president if the president dies, or the president resigns, or is incapacitated, or whatever. Those are really the only two responsibilities of the vice presidency that are actually spelled out in law. In fact, it was vague in the 1840s. You remember from sophomore year, maybe, but it was pretty vague about whether the vice president actually becomes president if the president dies. President Harrison died, remember, after a month, the old Tippecanoe, and then Tyler, too, who's the vice president, became the president, but there was some controversy at first because it doesn't say exactly that the vice president becomes president in the Constitution. It says that the vice president shall have all the duties of the president, shall act as president. So it's a little bit ambiguous, but Tyler said, I'm officially the president, and from that point on, whenever the president has died, then the vice president becomes fully president. It was made more specific in the 25th Amendment, which was passed in 1967, where it specifically says if the president dies or resigns, then the vice president becomes president. But before that, even that was a little bit vague. So they sometimes say the vice president is a heartbeat away from the presidency. Basically, there was an old joke that John McCain gave when there was some talk about him becoming vice president. All you really have to do is check on the president's health every morning. There really is no other responsibilities for the vice president. But for most of American history, the vice presidency was really not an important position. The person who was picked as vice president by the Democratic or Republican Party was generally somebody who'd been in office a very long time, who'd served the party loyally as a senator, as a governor. Somebody was put in the ticket because they're from a state that the presidential candidate wants to win. So often these political calculations were the main reasons why somebody was actually put on the ticket as vice president. But once they became vice president, they really didn't do much of anything. It was almost seen as a retirement gift, like, thank you for your service to the party. Instead of a gold watch, they give you the vice presidency. But in recent decades, the vice presidency has become more important. Vice presidents have been given more responsibility. Richard Nixon was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president. He was given a lot of responsibility as VP. George Bush was Ronald Reagan's VP. The man who probably was the first very active vice president was Walter Mondale, who was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And President Carter actually gave him responsibilities over, over important government policies. And that was really kind of a first, and that was in the 1970s. Before that, the vice president really didn't have many official responsibilities. So basically, the VP does whatever the president asks him to do or her to do. It's really kind of an ill-defined position, believe it or not. Some of our recent vice presidents have been a lot more active. Dick Cheney. Al Gore was with Bill Clinton's vice president. He was given responsibility for reorganizing government, for environmental policy. Dick Cheney was George Bush Jr.'s vice president. Dick Cheney had a huge role in the Bush administration and was kind of the architect of a lot of the foreign adventures or misadventures of the Bush administration, particularly the Iraq War, and instituting a policy of torture against people who were accused of terrorism. So he was very, very active vice president and kind of became, for a lot of people, a symbol of everything they hated about the Bush administration. Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, also had responsibility for handling foreign and domestic policy. Obama gave him responsibility for Iraq. He gave him responsibility for making sure that stimulus money was actually spent appropriately. So he was actually given a lot of responsibility as vice president. In recent years, also, the vice presidency is kind of seen as a stepping stone to the presidency, and not just in the sense of, she waits to see if the president dies. Now the vice presidency is kind of seen as, well, once the president's term is up or terms are up, then they themselves are going to seek the presidency. But that, Joe Biden, obviously was elected president. He had been VP, for Obama. Al Gore ran for president. George Bush Sr. ran for president when they had both been vice presidents. Richard Nixon. So in recent decades, that's kind of been the way that VPs kind of look toward the White House. Eventually, they want to be president themselves, even though historically that wasn't the case. As we said, the VP was just kind of a retirement gift. Your political career kind of stopped with the vice presidency. But now, of course, that's not the case. And I'm sure Kamala Harris has presidential ambitions herself. So, is hoping that, she can run for president, I'm assuming, run for president when Joe Biden leaves office, whether that's in 2024 or 2028. Biden was actually a very, very active vice president. We saw him all over the place. He actually was the first person in the Obama administration to publicly endorse gay marriage, where he said, I support it. He was sometimes known for kind of his verbal flubs when he whispered in Obama, or not whispered, because we heard it, in Obama's ear after Obamacare was passed. This is a big effing deal. And then that got a lot of attention. But part of the way that a vice president actually becomes important is based on his relationship with the president. If the VP usually has a good relationship with the president, then the president usually gives that person more responsibility. Some VPs historically have not had the best relationships with their bosses, with the president, and then the presidents tend to give them less responsibility. So a lot of the vice president's job depends on how close and how friendly they are with the president, whether they get along with the president. All right, let's talk now about the cabinet, the presidential cabinet. Now, the Article 2 of the Constitution spells out the cabinet as, quote, the principal officers in each of the executive departments. So that really is the only mention of the cabinet in the Constitution. A cabinet member requires Senate approval. So if the president appoints, as we talked about earlier, if the president appoints someone to the cabinet, that person would then have to be confirmed by the Senate by majority vote. Now, how does the president decide who to appoint to his cabinet? There are a lot of factors. Some are ideological. So if you're a Democratic president, sometimes you try to have some liberals in the cabinet, some moderates in the cabinet, try to balance it out. Republican presidents tend to have, conservative and even more conservative cabinet appointments. Diversity is a factor, especially in Democratic administrations, where they try to appoint women cabinet members, minority cabinet members. That's a priority too among Republicans, but usually less. But Joe Biden actually said that, he wants a cabinet that looks as diverse as America. So that diversity is a factor. The region of the country the person is from is a factor, and it's actually been a bigger factor historically than it's been lately. And the one thing that I think should be the biggest factor in determining who gets these appointments, and often is not, is whether that person has expertise in that area. Right? You're going to appoint some random person to be in charge of foreign policy for America, right? You're supposed to want somebody who actually has previous experience dealing with that area. So if somebody's going to be the agriculture secretary, you want somebody who has some experience in foreign policy, but foreign policy. But that hasn't been as big of a factor as you could argue it should be. Policy expertise. Often cabinet appointments are just basically political payoffs. Like, you helped me in the campaign, so I'm going to give you a big cabinet role. Or maybe you're the governor, but your term is about to expire, so you're kind of looking for a new job. And you're close to the president, so he appoints you to a cabinet position. So there are a lot of factors that actually go in to deciding who actually gets a cabinet position. The title, again, for cabinet members are secretary, except for the attorney general, who's in charge of Justice Department. But every other cabinet member is called secretary. So the cabinet departments, and I'll name them now. We have 15 cabinet departments. First is the State Department. They're in charge of foreign policy. The Treasury Department, in charge of the nation's finances. The Defense, some of these are self-explanatory, so I won't get into that. The Defense Department. So Secretary of Defense. The Justice Department, led by the Attorney General, who's in charge of enforcing our nation's laws. The Interior Department, which focuses on our national parks and things like that. The Agriculture Department, which is in charge of America's foreign policy. The Commerce Department, in charge of the government's relationship with business. The Labor Department, in charge of government's relationship with workers. That used to be one department, Commerce and Labor, but it was split up in the early 20th century. Health and Human Services. That's a very important department. They're in charge of Medicare and Social Security and regulating the nation's hospitals and things like that. HUD, Housing and Urban Development. They're in charge of coming up with the nation's housing policy and also policies with regard to cities. The Transportation Department, the Energy Department, the Education Department, the Veterans Affairs Department, and finally the Homeland Security Department. The Homeland Security Department is the most recent cabinet position that was created after 9/11, and that's in charge of the nation's security. Not only protect us against terrorism, but also they're in charge of our immigration policy. The Coast Guard is now in the jurisdiction of Homeland Security. So basically, all the agencies of government that protect our country are under the umbrella of the Homeland Security Department. So there are 15 cabinet departments, all led by secretaries, except again for justice, which is led by the attorney general. The State Department, the Secretary of State, is usually seen as the most important member of the cabinet. The State Department is in charge of America's foreign policy. It's been around since the beginning of our country. The first Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. There's deputy secretaries of state who are in charge of different areas of the world. So there's a deputy secretary of state for Africa, for Europe, for Russia, for the Pacific, and so on. And then there's assistant deputy secretaries, all appointed by the president. Ambassadors come under the jurisdiction of the State Department. Remember, we talked a little about this. Often ambassadors to other countries, we only have an ambassador to countries we have relations with, and there are a few countries we don't have relations with, like Cuba and North Korea, Iran. So there's no ambassadors there. But like in every country we do have relations with, there's an ambassador. 2/3 of all the ambassadors that the president appoints are diplomats, professional diplomats, members of the Foreign Service, people who, who's commit their careers to diplomacy. But 1/3 of the ambassador appointments are political appointments. People who made large contributions to the president's campaign. People who, are politically close to the president. So I always think that's very problematic, because the thing is, if we're appointing ambassadors just as political payoffs, as just people who, might be close to the president or gave money to the president, there's something a little skeezy about that, I think. It's kind of legalized bribery in many ways. And every president has done it. And it's not just like either Democratic presidents or Republican presidents. It's kind of seen as, oh, that's what you do, that, big campaign contributors get good ambassadorships. Like, you raise a lot of money for the president, you become the ambassador of the Bahamas or something like that. So the Foreign Service members, the foreign people and the professional diplomats tend to get the less prestigious posts. The really prestigious posts, like England and ambassadors to really big, really countries like that, tend to be political appointments, which again is problematic. We're not going to go into detail with all 15, with just a couple, but the Defense Department, that's located at the Pentagon, right, which is the defense headquarters for the United States in Virginia. The whole idea of the Defense Department is that civilians are in charge. Because remember when we were talking about, we had a little bit of debate about this, the whole idea of making the president the commander-in-chief of the military, the whole idea is that, we have a civilian in charge of the military. So that way we can never have a coup. A general can't just order his troops to take over the government, like happens in a lot of countries. But all the leadership of the Pentagon is supposed to be civilians. So if the president, the Secretary of Defense, who's actually cannot be a member of the military, and then the deputy secretaries and all of those folks, those are all civilians. The idea is that we should have civilian control of the military. That, professional soldiers should not be the ones making the decisions. They're the ones who follow orders. They shouldn't be the ones making decisions. Federal agent, and President Trump has just removed the entire top leadership of the Defense Department, the top 4 people in the Defense Department, which, again, leads to many questions. What's going on there? Why do you, of all the people after the election, why do you remove them? That's, I wonder. I think we all wonder. Now, there are federal agencies that carry out specific government functions. The FBI, that everybody knows who they are. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, they're the ones who are going to have to approve the vaccine and approve all new drugs. The IRS, collecting taxes. The CIA, our spy agency. The Post Office. So there are a lot of federal agencies that handle a lot of different federal responsibilities, and the president appoints the leader of all those agencies. I just named a handful, but there are tons of federal agencies. I just look up a couple. NASA, Amtrak, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, which regulates campaign laws, the Environmental Protection Agency, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is in charge of regulating the stock market. So tons of these federal agencies exist. Finally, I want to talk about the White House staff, like the people who actually work intimately in the White House for the president. Those people are not subject to Senate approvals. Like all the people I mentioned, right, in the past for most of the video, they have to be approved by the Senate. People do not have to. The White House staff does not have to be approved by the Senate. The EOP, the Executive Office of the President, they work at the Executive Office Building, which is actually on the grounds of the White House. And the EOP coordinates several independent agencies, and they all handle, they all have different responsibilities. So there are some members of the EOP who handle the budget. There are some members of the EOP that handle the economy, the Council of Economic Advisors. That's a really big one. There's just like the staff, like the people who just work in the White House, the president's senior advisors, and people like that. These are the people those staffers are the president's inner circle. He's usually closer to those people than he are to his own cabinet members. Some of the cabinet members he might not know that well, or they're just kind of doing their thing, doing their job, so they're not as involved with the president on a day-to-day basis as people who are on the White House staff. So they travel with the president. Usually they work with the president quite intimately. A lot of them interact daily with the president. Believe it or not, I've never been in the Oval Office or the White House, but the Oval Office, the White House is apparently, the working area of the White House is apparently very cramped. Like, that there's actually like there's everybody's kind of on top of one another, which is why COVID spread like crazy there. Generally, these people work very closely together. The person who's responsible for everything, the running of the White House, is the chief of staff. Mark Meadows is Trump's. He got COVID. He's the one who actually did the negotiations, unsuccessful negotiations to get more stimulus funding. Now Biden appointed Ron Klain to be the chief of staff, and this is a very, very important position. He's basically responsible for the operation of the White House. And then there are people who also work in the White House very intimately with the president. The press secretary, right? That's the one who does the press conferences. The White House chief counsel, that's the president's lawyer. Not the president's lawyer personally, but the lawyer for the presidency. Trump sometimes didn't realize the distinction there. The National Security Advisor, that's the person who actually gives the president, advice on international issues and threats to the country. The NSC, or the National Security Council, is actually defined by law. The NSC is made up of the president, the vice president, the secretaries of state and defense, the CIA director, and the aforementioned National Security Advisor. And these people actually give or discuss with the president national security threats and issues. Every day the president gets what they call a PDB, a personal daily briefing, which lists for him all the biggest threats facing the country that day. And Trump apparently does not do the personal daily briefings very often. Sometimes to get his attention, they actually put pictures in it, or like put his name everywhere because they said that's the way it will get him to read it. But presidents are supposed to read those, and that's the first thing the president does every morning. Excuse me, after he gets out of bed and after he gets dressed and comes down to the White House, the first thing he's supposed to do is read the personal daily briefing. And that's kind of the beginning of the president's day, or at least it typically is. I would assume we'll go back to that when we have a more conventional president. All right, guys. So I know this was a long video, but this kind of but it was very important because you guys have to know who's going to be working with and for the president. Which again, we'll be seeing this a lot in the news in the next few weeks as President Biden, President-elect Biden, begins filling out his White House staff and his cabinet. All right, so I'll see all you guys on Thursday. Make sure you all sent me your papers on Google Classroom, and I'll see you on Thursday. Peace.